So welcome to today's CG seminar. My name's Rachel Brooks, based at Oxford, and I'll be chairing today's seminar. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Stephen Alvarado, who's joining us from the University of Notre Dame in the US. So thank you very much for coming all this way to talk to us. Stephen is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Notre Dame, and he has quite wide-ranging research interests, including inequality, education, neighbourhood effects, immigration, race, ethnicity, and health. And you'll be talking about some of those today, won't you? Stephen's research relies primarily on nationally representative federal panel data from the US Bureau of Labour Statistics and the US National Centre for Educational Statistics. His work also uses state administrative data and data from international research collaborators. And Stephen brings together sociological research, sociological theory, I should say, and cutting-edge quasi-experimental quantitative analysis to shed light on a variety of social processes that are important to the public, to policymakers, and to researchers. So we're really pleased that Stephen's going to be sharing some of his research with us today. And as you can see from the slides, the title of his talk is The Growing Divide, Neighbourhood Disadvantage and College Outcomes Across Demographic Cohorts. So I think Stephen's going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then hopefully there'll be time for you to ask questions, for comments and discussion. And as usual, please put questions and comments in the chat as we go through. So I'm going to hand over to Stephen there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's a great pleasure to be here, and welcome everybody online and in person. Thank you for coming to my talk. I'm very delighted to be here for my first time visiting the UK. What better place to go than to Oxford? This is obviously a very highly regarded institution in the United States, and we are very happy to be here. I have about 30 minutes. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I will present and leave time at the end for questions and answers. But please feel free, those of you in the room and online, to I guess either in person and or virtually raise your hand if you have any clarifying questions, technical questions throughout the talk. I'll be happy to answer those as we go along. I have been playing around with the title. Success by address is and growing divide. I'm going back and forth, but it's all the same talk. Thinking about how neighborhood disadvantage has evolved in the past 50 or so years, and has had effects on educational outcomes. So with that, I'll just jump right in, I think. So quickly, I'm going to show some national overview data before jumping into the restricted survey data that forms the base of the analysis. So first, just in terms of introduction here, these first few slides, as many of you in the room are very well aware of, in the United States, inequality has been growing and in the past several decades, and has been driven largely by educational attainment differentials, right? And so what we see for both males and females from National Center for Educational Statistics on this slide here is that we have had both a steady but also growing disparity in terms of the median earnings for individuals who have a college degree compared to those who do not. Can you see my cursor? Yeah, you can see my cursor. And so over the past few decades, what we've seen in the United States, at least, is a takeoff for both females and males in terms of the amount of money that individuals make as you gain educational credentials and expertise in the United States. Obviously, huge discussion about why this is happening. Largely, obviously, shift in post-industrial society to a more technologically based and high skills based economy has largely driven this. But inequality in general has been growing based on educational inequality, which is clearly seen on this graph. And when we look specifically also on the types of colleges that individuals go to, we also see a earnings disparity, an earnings gap, right? So that individuals who attend not just college, right, but more selective institutions. We're talking about the Oxfords, the Cambridges, the Harvards, the Notre Dames, the Berkeleys, right? Which I have highlighted in the green circles here. are increasingly giving individuals more in terms of their logged earnings and earnings returns and earnings potential in the labor market. So it's not just a question about whether or not you go to college, but it's also increasingly a question about what types of college you go to, right? And so college selectivity is becoming another axis of inequality over the past few decades. Did this switch? No, it's not switch. Okay. So undergirding all this, for those of us who are parents in the room, we all know that we love our kids a lot. But one thing that's interesting is that it seems that we have been loving our kids more and more across time. And here's some data in terms of looking at the investments that parents make in their kids' lives. What we see is that there's a clear gradient, right? As you move up from the educational across the educational distribution, from parents who have less than a high school diploma, all the way to parents who have an advanced degree. In many facets of educational activities, you see that parents with higher degrees, higher earnings, invest a lot more time in their kids than people who have a less than a high school degree or even a high school diploma, right? Many reasons why. Obviously, you have to have money, right, to visit a library and to take time off and things like that. But in general, the story is that it seems that there has been increasing interest, right? And perhaps one of the reasons why is the first slide, right? What was on the first slide is the fact that over time we've been seeing larger and larger returns to college degrees, right? And to specifically also selectivity. And not only in kindergarten, but throughout grade school and in grades 1 through 5, you see the same pattern holding out in terms of parents taking kids to museums or attending class events, volunteering at schools, et cetera. Clear educational gradient is happening here as well, right? So with that backdrop, I want to highlight two larger secular trends that have been going on in American society since about 1970. The first is that post-secondary enrollment among high school completers has been growing increasingly over time. And here I show the graph broken down by race and ethnicity across all racial and ethnic groups in the United States. What we've seen is that more people are going to college since 1970, right? Perhaps responding to this wage premium for college going. You see a natural reaction, perhaps in terms of the enrollments, right? Of going to college, of enrolling in post-secondary educational institutions in the United States over time. This is the first big secular trend that I want to highlight. A second that has been going on simultaneously since about 1970 is the separation in terms of where individuals with a lot of money live and individuals who have less money live. So as we've been moving along throughout these last 4 to 5 decades in the United States, we've also seen that income segregation has been growing in the United States, and particularly among families with children. So that is households, let's say, with children living inside of them have been increasingly separating from one another in terms of the average income of the neighborhoods. And so families with the means arguably have been entering into this competition game and have been increasingly separating themselves, right? For perhaps reasons of access to resources in higher income neighborhoods, not only material resources, but also perhaps social resources and all the things that we talk about when we're thinking about residential segregation and or neighborhood effects. So we have these two trends going on. Okay, on the one hand, we've seen educational enrollment in post-secondary educational institutions increasing over time, and also families separating themselves in terms of the residential locations by income across the past several decades. So there's various papers that have investigated the specific trend. I'm not going to get into it too deeply, but essentially, using restricted microdata from the United States Census Bureau, researchers have been able to confirm that residential income segregation has indeed been increasing, and particularly for families with children for the past few decades. Now, putting these two things together, you can see already that these two things sort of hang together, right? In the blue line, you see the increase in college enrollment since about 1970 through about 2015 or so. Things have started to drop off a little bit, as you can see. But nevertheless, during the almost entire period, also you've seen the rate of income segregation is increasing across time as well. Where families with means have been able to what I call compete in this offshoot of opportunity hoarding, which I call the spatial opportunity hoarding, right? Being able to access not only resources in terms of material resources, such as a home that's going to gain equity over time, or social capital. What I argue, and what Ann Owens in particular hints at in her American Sociological Review paper on the topic of income segregation, is this idea that schools are becoming increasingly the sort of battlefields upon which many of these processes of inequality and of opportunity hoarding are being played out. That is, as the returns to college degrees have been increasing over time, it's not just the address that matters, right, for success. It's also about the schools that are associated with that address. In the United States, largely elementary schools in particular, the neighborhood school model has dominated, where the catchment zones around schools are tied specifically to neighborhoods. And so moving into neighborhoods isn't just about your neighbors and your actual house, it's also about what schools that your children are going to attend. And in this process of spatial opportunity hoarding, I developed a sort of a hint at perhaps how neighborhoods might matter more than what we have thought about, both in terms of their tie to larger forces of inequality, but also as they themselves have evolved over time to perhaps become increasingly important aspects of life in the United States. Okay, so where do we go from here? What is known? We know that college enrollment and completion have been increasing over the past several decades. We know that inequality in general has been rising. We see clear gaps in earning by educational levels that are widening over time. We see that residential income segregation has been rising as well, and that perhaps parents are increasingly making residential choices based on school options. So this brings me to my research questions. Number one is, does exposure to neighborhood disadvantage in childhood impact college outcomes at all? Okay, and specifically what I'm going to be looking at is college enrollment and college selectivity. And second, I asked, does the impact of childhood neighborhood disadvantage change over time? So following these two secular trends that have been increasing side by side, I argue that perhaps neighborhoods themselves have become more and more valuable over time, where in, say, the 1970s in the United States, where you lived didn't really matter as much in terms of your educational outcomes and perhaps even your labor market outcomes down the road as they do today. That there may have been a looser coupling between the two things in the past than there is today. And lastly, I look at differences in these effects by race and ethnicity in the United States to see if maybe the increase in the hypothesized increase in the force of neighborhoods to matter for educational outcomes varies for white students or Black students or Latino students in the United States. Okay, so to test these hypotheses and try to answer these research questions, I looked at 3 cohorts of students. So think about these simply as students who were going to college in the early 1980s, about early 2000s or mid 2000s, and then into the 2000 teens. So I start out with data from the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics. I use restricted data that has been following students and their children since the late 1970s. In 1979, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics started following a cohort of 12,686 men and women. And some of these folks were still in school when they started. So in 1979, of these 12,686 men and women, the age range was 14 to 22. Okay, so I can look and see where some of these folks grew up, and I can see where they ended up in terms of their college going in the early 80s. About 24.5% of this sample went to college, and the modal year for first enrollment for this group, for this cohort, was about 1984. Starting in 1986, the Bureau of Labor Statistics started following all of the children of the 1979 sample mothers. So there were men and women, as I mentioned in the 79 cohort. Some of those women had children. Most of those women had children. All of their children started getting followed as well. So now we have a second generation of the NLSY and a second cohort of kids to follow. So they started having kids in 1970. Remember, they were 14 to 22. So some of these kids are super old, but some of them, were born up until about the late, where I look at them into the late 1990s and early 2000s, where I can look at their college outcomes because I need them to grow up, essentially. But these children, similar to their parents, had about a quarter of them going to college. And the modal year, the most common year in which these kids went to college was 2008. Okay, so then I move away from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I use data from the National Center for Educational Statistics. And this is a sample of about 25,000 students in the United States who were in ninth grade in 2009. And these folks, a little bit perhaps hinting at what I've been talking about before, have higher rates of college going already. About 41% of this sample went to college, and their modal year of college going was 2013. So I now have 3 cohorts of students to follow. I have the 1979 sample, I have their children, and I have the students that were in the high school longitudinal study, which have no relation to the first group. Okay. Okay. So what am I calling neighborhood disadvantage? So my main predictor of what I'm looking at is whether or not children were exposed to or whether or not respondents were exposed to childhood neighbor disadvantage. So in the 1979 sample, I'm looking at those folks who were 14 to 18 in 1979. Looking at their childhood, all of those years, and I'm looking at these 7 characteristics of their neighborhoods. I know what their census tract is. In the United States, a census tract essentially is defined by a region with about 4,000 individuals residing in that region. So you can imagine in Manhattan, 4,000 people, you can get that in a few blocks. Or you're talking about Indiana in the middle of nowhere where I live, right? That can be a larger geography. So these vary in terms of geographic size, but they usually stick together in about 4,000 people. So I look at the tract characteristics that includes the percent of individuals in the tract in poverty, percent unemployed, those out of the labor force, the percent of folks who have a bachelor's degree at least, the percent of managers and professionals, the median income and the median housing value for those tracts. And I basically merge these together, right, to create an index, a composite, to give me an underlying sense of neighborhood disadvantage. And I am able to link individuals to these tracts using the census geocodes. And that's what makes these data restricted, is that I have the geocodes for the 79 sample and the CYA sample, their children, and the HSLS, the High School Longitudinal Survey. So that is my main predictor. In terms of my my specific predictor, what I do is I create a binary measure of whether or not you were in a disadvantaged neighborhood when you were a kid. I create, as I mentioned before, a continuous scale of these 7 census tract characteristics per each wave. And then I look at the childhood age ranges for the NLSY 79 sample. As I mentioned, they started by being 14 to 22 in 1979. So I only have ages 14 to 18 for them. So like adolescence exposure. For the childhood and young adult sample, their kids, I have them since birth. So at any age, younger than 19, I can measure their exposure to childhood neighbor disadvantage. For the HSLS sample, I have 2 points of exposure in 9th grade and 11th grade. So basically high school, similar to the 79 sample. And so in general, while these vary a little bit, they're covering childhood and adolescence. And that's what I'm concerned with. Anything before they go to college, right? Any years I can gather, and these are the specific years. I create a raw quintile. I create a quintile out of the raw scale scores. And then which is ranging from the least disadvantaged or the most advantaged kids in the first quintile, the most disadvantaged kids in the fifth quintile, and then I create a binary measure. I average these values across all the quintile ways, and then I create a binary measure so that if on average your childhood neighborhood was in quintiles 1 to 3, I call that being not being exposed to neighbor disadvantage. And if you were in the top 40% of neighborhoods of neighborhood disadvantage, I'm calling that being exposed to neighbor disadvantage. And I play around with these, and we can talk about that in the Q&A as well. But this is the main predictor, this binary predictor, this binary measure of neighborhood disadvantage that's created out of the quintiles, that is created out of the raw scores, that is created out of 7 track characteristics. So I look at 2 outcomes, as I mentioned before. So the first is college selectivity that I want to talk about. Surprisingly to me and my research team, the U.S. News and World Report, which is the main outlet, for better or worse, that individuals in the United States look to in terms of trying to gauge college's selectivity, does not include a selectivity variable. So we had to go through every single college in the book and apply a selectivity code that they provided, but they just didn't provide the data. In any case, we have schools ranging from most selective all the way down to least selective, and the most selective have a score of 5 on their selectivity score. And then college enrollment. I won't get into the details, but it's basically enrollment in 4-year colleges. So just think about it that way, with some complexities in there and how we did this, but essentially it's looking at 4-year colleges. We include an array of control variables, which is standard variables, including parents, education and income, and children's family structure, family income and poverty status. Okay, so of course, when thinking about contextual effects, we have to deal and contend with the issue of endogeneity, thinking about how selective, non-random selection into neighborhoods can potentially bias our estimates of the neighborhood's effect, right? So people's exposure to racist segregation policies in the United States, people's preferences, all of these sorts of things got to sort through. And what I'm following is a more recent approach to dealing with issues of selectivity when using longitudinal data, as I am. And what it boils down to, this paper by Felix Elwert and Fabian Pfeffer that came out in Sociological Methods a few years ago now, which I lovingly call the EP estimator, the Elwert-Pfeffer estimator, essentially uses a future measure of the treatment variable to try to control for some of these unobservables. And so in a nutshell, what this looks like is, of course, this pesky U vector of variables is what I'm trying to minimize, right? Is the influence of an unobserved confounder that can influence not only where you live, that is the treatment, or your exposure to childhood neighborhood, but it can also impact your outcome, right? In this case, it's college selectivity or college enrollment. And what they proposed and what I follow is that if we can get a measure of the neighborhood, in this case, in a future date after the outcome, so in this case, after college is completed, well, that unobserved confounder that we're so worried about should continue to have a similar impact, right, as it would on the original treatment. And if you include this new term, this F term in your model that is control for a future measurement of the treatment, you can potentially minimize or address the same influence that unobserved variable would have on your original treatment variable. So just to sort of help us conceptualize this, what I look at is, say, a kid's exposure to childhood neighborhood disadvantage in 6th grade, right? Beginning of middle school in the United States. Then I look at the effect of that exposure, just pretend I'm just looking at 1 year of exposure, 6th grade, on enrolling in college, 7 years later. Okay. So what I do then is I let the data move past college years, average, years of to completion be about 5 or 6 years. And I look at the measurement of the same neighborhood where they lived when they were kids, right? Because I know the location of that neighborhood when they're 6th grade. And I see what the level of disadvantage is on that future date. Okay. And then I include that into the model. That is the future treatment. And again, conceptually, what that should be doing is helping us control for some of these unobservables. I'm not going to go into the details. We can talk about some of these assumptions later on, but I'm just going to dive right into the descriptive results and the main results as well. So going cohort by cohort, we can see, for instance, that four-year college enrollment is highest for the kids coming from the most advantaged neighborhoods. That is these blue bars, the first quintile of my 5-quintile neighborhood disadvantage scale. And as you get into worse neighborhoods, right, especially, once you get to the second quintile, there's a huge precipitous drop. But slowly but surely, you continue to see drops in the just mean, the average levels of enrollment into college. Okay, so this is for the 1979 cohort, and this is ranging for all the years that I have access to their college data, which is just the early 1980s, from 1984 to 1986. And these are people who were 17 to 25 years old. So just looking at people who are, the average age for people who are in college. So as you might guess, as you move to the second cohort, the NLSY children and young adults, you see a similar pattern. I just have more years of data for them, right? Going from 1994 to 2020. Similarly, as in 1979, you see that the blue bars are the tallest bars across all the different years that I have data. Meaning, once again, that kids growing up in the nicest neighborhoods have the largest average expectation of college enrollment, as you would expect, right? Another thing you can see clearly here too is that in general, there's more kids going to college, right? Just like I showed in the outset as well, right? And that mimics the larger data set as well. Going to the third cohort, the high school longitudinal survey, for these kids, I also see that college enrollment is highest for kids coming from the nicest neighborhoods, right? So across all three cohorts, descriptively, we see that there is a clear association in terms of where you come from and how likely you are to enroll in college. And now, just looking at from running a regression model with no controls in it, we see that across years, the influence of neighborhood disadvantage, being exposed to a disadvantaged neighborhood, seems to be growing, right? And this would fit with the hypothesis that I originally had, that neighborhoods matter more now than they used to, going across from the 79 sample to the CYA to the HSLS. In terms of selectivity, similarly, you see a stronger impact, perhaps, of neighborhood disadvantage, but you see this sort of quadratic, this bowing a little bit here in the results, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So now finally, let's look at the results for the fully adjusted model that take into account unobserved confounding. Okay, so looking at the results for four-year college enrollment, and I apologize for the small font here, but essentially what we're looking at here is the NLSY 79 zero order results, which we just looked at, and then the NLSY fully adjusted. So once I adjust for the unobserved confounding, I see essentially that in the 79 cohort, there seems to be some weird increase, slightly significant increase in terms of the impact of neighborhood disadvantage on college enrollment. Similarly, when we go to the next cohort, it seems that the effect seems to be ostensibly greater in terms of the severity or the reduction in terms of the likelihood of going to college for the CYA cohort, but that is also only slightly significant statistically. Finally, in the most recent cohort, you see that there is a clear, once adjustments have been made for unobservables, a negative impact of growing up in a disadvantaged neighborhood on the likelihood of going to college. In terms of college selectivity, which is the second outcome that I was interested in, the results here are a little bit different. What I find here is that moving from the zero order results in the 1979 sample to the fully adjusted results from the 1979 sample, there doesn't seem to be any impact of exposure to neighborhood disadvantage on children's average levels of selectivity. In terms of the next cohort, the CYA cohort, it does seem that there is a significant impact, even after controlling for unobservables in the EP estimator, in the future treatments estimator. However, when we turn to the HSLS, the more recent cohort, doesn't seem like there's much action going on there once these adjustments have been made. Okay, so a little bit contrary to expectations there. When turning to race and ethnic heterogeneity, however, this is perhaps going to shed a little bit more light on the story here, on the overall story. This is loading. I apologize. I'm not sure. Just spinning on me. Come on, next slide. Maybe I'll go to this one instead. I did not lose internet. Okay. Okay. So in terms of enrollment in the most recent four-year college by race and ethnicity, what looks to be happening when looking at this 1979 cohort, this first cohort, this oldest cohort, the kids who were going to college in the early 1980s, is that when we break this down by race and ethnicity, looking at white students, Black students, and Latino students, it seems that it is white students for whom specifically there doesn't seem to be much of an impact of living in a disadvantaged neighborhood. Somewhat paradoxically, it might seem paradoxical that Latinos in the green and Black students in the red seem to somehow be increasing their likelihood of going to college from growing up in a disadvantaged neighborhood. Now, what I am toying around with and thinking about this, and this can be part of Q&A, is that perhaps affirmative action policies, which were in their heyday in the 1980s in the United States, might be driving or might be contributing to the explanation of why it is that Black and Latino students who grow up in disadvantaged neighborhoods might be exposed to more resources in their schools, might be experiencing more busing in their schools, or something to that nature that could be increasing their enrollment in four-year colleges. These results here are for the second cohort, and similarly, what I see here is that once we get into that second cohort, now the next time period, it seems that white students seem to be suffering the most from growing up in a disadvantaged neighborhood, being exposed to neighborhood disadvantage, but Black and Latino students seem to be having no real effects. And this coincides with the period when affirmative action policy, specifically busing, which is the most major affirmative action policy in the United States, started to get ramped down. Okay, and that might explain why it is that there is not much action going on in terms of where they're growing up, Black and Latino students. In terms of college enrollment. College enrollment now for the most recent cohort of students, broken down by race and ethnicity, again shows this precipitous drop in the likelihood of enrolling in college for white students who are exposed to disadvantaged neighborhoods, and a slight drop, but a non-significant difference for Latino students and for Black students who are growing up in disadvantaged neighborhoods as opposed to advantaged ones. Now, these last slide of results here are just going to do the same thing, looking at the results for race and ethnicity, but now for college selectivity. And once again, sequentially going from the 1979 cohort, what we see here is that there doesn't seem to be much action for any group. You can maybe, try to make a story about, this slight drop for white students in terms of their likelihoods of going to college, of their median selectivity of the colleges that they did attend, and similarly a slight increase in terms of the Black and Latino students, but there's not much action going on here. These things are not significantly different from one another. The CYA, you start to see that all groups seem to be experiencing a decline in their median selectivity scores for the colleges that they do attend for white, Black, and Latino students, from students who who grew up in better neighborhoods versus students who grew up in worse neighborhoods. And then finally, for the most recent cohort, there's not much action here, not much difference in terms of the racial and ethnic median scores, the median scores for college selectivity by race and ethnicity. Okay, so to wrap it all up, what are some main takeaways? Neighborhood disadvantage exposure in childhood does seem to impact college enrollment and college selectivity, which seems to be a departure from previous work that's used other nationally representative data, such as the AdHealth. It does seem that there's a growing salience of neighborhood context over the past several decades, but this is mainly a college enrollment story. Doesn't seem to be holding up too much for college selectivity. That might be too fine of an outcome, maybe, perhaps. In terms of racial and ethnic heterogeneity, there is some going on, but obviously there's some complexities, and there is maybe a story to tell about the impacts of affirmative action policies across these 3 different cohorts. And it does seem that these results, at least some of them, do seem to be robust to unobserved confounding. It seems that the Elbert-Pfeffer estimator is doing its job in terms of reducing spuriousness with this creative approach that is applicable here because I have longitudinal data. But of course, we can talk about some of those limitations. In terms of discussion and next steps, I started out by highlighting, and I continue in this paper to think about the interconnectedness of secular trends in college enrollment and neighborhood stratification. My hunch is that there's something going on in terms of how it is that college enrollment is becoming more and more valuable in the United States society, and what that does to parents, how that motivates parents to start very early investing in their children, not only in taking them to museums and libraries and volunteering at school, but also, perhaps most importantly, where they live and where they raise their kids, primarily because of the tight coupling between neighborhoods and schooling in the United States. One thing I wonder about, and could perhaps open up for discussion, is thinking about how the recent slowdown in college enrollment can affect spatial opportunity hoarding and social closure. So as we saw, since about 2015, college going in the United States has actually been going down, right? After these multiple decades of just going up and up and up and up and up, college is also getting more and more expensive, right? As colleges are responding to these demands, right? Making it increasingly expensive for students to go to college. And my question is, well, what's going to happen with, this tight coupling that I proposed initially between neighborhoods and schools? If parents aren't as motivated nowadays to send their kids off to college because they're, worrying about how they're going to pay for it, and maybe are considering alternative career paths for their children, will neighborhoods matter as much anymore? Maybe not. But it can also perhaps increase inequality if those parents who do have the means and are particularly college oriented cluster even more to one another, as those families who are considering alternative career options that don't include college for their children start to peel off out of that college going game. As soon as the shutdown of the, if you guys know, we're now in day 21 of the United States shutdown, and I can get back into the lab and access these restricted data. I'm going to start to apply some machine learning techniques, some causal trees and forests, to try to peel off some heterogeneous effects that can perhaps improve our understanding of what types of, for whom these neighborhood effects might be more or less, and get away from some of the obvious suspects like racial and ethnic heterogeneity or gender heterogeneity. I also want to look at college completion, look at the data and follow the students to college completion. And then perhaps apply some of this data to state administrator data that have in Indiana and Wisconsin. So some limitations, of course, I'm defining neighborhoods as census tracts. Obviously, we can talk about blocks, we can talk about block groups or larger contexts. You might also be wondering about schools. Shouldn't schools matter? We can think about how school contexts matter, which are not explicitly controlled for in the data in the analyses that I do, might impact these results. Other outcomes, such as student achievement, might be interesting to look at as well, and might enlighten this conversation even further. And thinking about individual neighborhood components, so you recall I combined into a composite these 7 measures, but what about just looking at neighborhood poverty or neighborhood unemployment rates? And also looking at different college selectivity measures. Now, those are very hard to come by, as I mentioned before. It's very difficult to use the ones and create the ones that I use in this analysis, but that's also open for discussion as well. So I'll close with thanking my research assistants, Sophia Dueñas, Haddon Syed, multiple undergraduate RAs, both at Cornell and at Notre Dame, the Notre Dame Pop Analytics Lab, the Census Bureau, and the FSRDC at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago for allowing me access to the BLS data, and of course the National Center for Educational Statistics. And with that, thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for staying with me for this long, and I'm opening up for questions.
That was absolutely fascinating. People online, do feel free to put questions in the chat, and people online, do feel free to put your hand up. But maybe I'll just kick off while people are having a minute to think about their question.
Sure.
So I suppose I want to go back to the kind of drivers of residential segregation, and I guess your argument that it was all kind of education driven. But given the polarization we're seeing in American society, do you think there could be other drivers of that kind of segregation that aren't anything to do with education?
Are you talking about the all-white enclave that they're trying to build in Arkansas? Yeah, no, of course, there could be multiple drivers.
Is there any evidence, I suppose, about what is actually driving that?
Of the clustering? Well, what has dominated the discussion recently in terms of this empirical rise in income segregation by residents has been this this idea that schooling, access to good schools have been dominant. There's of course going to be variation across the vastness of the United States and North American continent, perhaps, where this may fall off. Think about my hometown in Los Angeles. Of course, schools are important, but there's all sorts of interests and different variations, topographical and amenity wise, that can attract individuals to neighborhoods and could be contributing to this polarization of folks with a lot of money and those who don't have a lot of money in where they live. But the dominant theme in this literature, in the segregation literature, has primarily focused in on access to "quote unquote" good schools. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any questions for you, David?
It was great, really interesting. I wonder what you thought of Annette Leroux's work on consultative cultivation, because it's all, her work is very much thinking about how middle-class parents invest a lot more in change, which is all what you're saying.
Yes.
And then I guess the next connection to that would be that those middle-class parents would also be investing in their schools.
Was that the last question?
They'd also be investing. They'd be pushing the schools to do things differently. They would be getting involved in that.
Those same parents.
Yeah. So they will be shaping that. They're not only cultivating their children, but cultivating their schools.
Oh yeah, no. I mean that's a great point. I mean it falls right in line in this idea of social closure. Thinking about Coleman's work, and thinking about, Bourdieu and this idea that, status, right, is being conveyed, right, through these activities, right? Parents are investing in their kids. I'm bringing my 10-year-old to Oxford, and he goes back. And what do all his fifth grade, sixth grade teachers do? They glorify this wonder kid who got to go spend, a few days at Oxford University, right? You can call me one of these concerted, cultivated parents, right? And in terms of, those parents impacting the schooling environment itself, yeah, absolutely. If, something is going on at my kid's school, for instance, I'm showing up, right, to participate in the Halloween hunt, right, or to go to, parent-teacher conferences and put my input, right? And as a member of the middle class, upper middle class, especially, with the cachet of being a university professor, I can obviously see Leroux's, Weber's, Bourdieu's ideas were being reflected and could potentially even impact these similar processes that I'm talking about as more and more parents are competing, right, for that that upward mobility, for that maintenance of status, or what have you. In the end, that access to this giant wage premium in the labor market that is manifested through college enrollment and highly selective college enrollment, you can see all these things playing out very clearly. So yeah, this is absolutely a relevant story.
We've got a question online from Gemma Catchpole. Gemma, I think I've enabled your mic and camera, so I don't know if you want to put your mic on and ask the question yourself. Oh, she's in a shared space. Okay, so I'll read out. So thank you, Stephen. On the slide showing the quintiles across the years, what's your explanation for the large Q5 purple increase in 2020? COVID, question mark.
Oh yeah, right here. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, jumping up. This is an interesting point. So this is from the child and young adults cohort. And so in 2020, these kids had to at least have been born in 2002 or so. And what might be going on there, is interesting, not only throughout their childhood and the type of exposure to neighborhood disadvantage that they experienced, but also what is happening with college enrollment at this point. What I suspect is going on here is that the reduction in SAT and ACT requirements in many colleges and universities during this time might be contributing to this. So you saw this in not only undergraduate enrollments, but also in graduate enrollments as U.S. universities started to roll back requirements for the GRE, the big, examination for graduate school entrance. Similarly, for many high school seniors, they were for the first time in we'll say in many decades, experiencing a moment where colleges and universities were no longer requiring or making it optional to submit your SAT and ACT scores, which might be contributing to some of these students who in many of these in this disadvantaged neighborhoods might have been smart enough to go, right, but lack the resources or lack the training for that would be required for SAT prep, ACT prep, right, that students in more advantaged neighborhoods might have been able to access, and might have been able to in this case be able to shine in other ways in terms of their GPAs, in terms of their letters of recommendation and things of that nature. So that is sort of the story that I can think about when considering this. Many factors. Great question.
Maybe if I could ask one more question then,
Sure.
Stephen. So I guess in the UK, universities use postcode data quite a lot, and there's a kind of debate about, the best type of that to use. Is that how is that used, if at all, by universities in America, and is that kind of a topic of discussion in terms of policy?
Oh wait, which kind of data?
So the geocode data that you were talking about. So where you're actually getting a measure of the area that people are living in and levels of deprivation.
So the question is how
is it used at all, and if so, how?
for the neighborhoods or for the schools?
I guess during the admissions process.
Oh.
So if I guess alongside affirmative action,
yes,
has it been part of admissions policies at all?
No. Well, more recently, now that affirmative action has been deemed unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court, but prior to that, it wasn't as much. I would say that universities did some of that, but in terms of trying to address historical disadvantages for minority groups, particularly for Black students and for Latino students in the United States, what most universities relied on were the racial and ethnic profiles of students, not so much the socioeconomic profiles of the neighborhoods that they lived in or the socioeconomic profiles of the schools that they attended. But that has been an increasingly important aspect of admissions because the Supreme Court did not rule against considering where students come from, which could obviously affect their educational outcomes. And what I argue could be, an increasingly important aspect of their educational trajectories, starting as early as kindergarten all the way through to high school. So it's in academic circles, I think more prevalent than that has been more prevalent than in lay circles over the years, but has been increasingly a prime topic of conversation for policy.
One of the debates in the UK is the postcode is sometimes always not quite specific enough.
Yes.
So you'll get, when you talked about block, I wasn't sure how big a block was.
So a block,
census code, you mentioned census code as well.
Yeah, so a block will physically be the streets surrounding a residence. Okay. So enclosed by, if it's on a grid in New York City, enclosed by four streets, 4 street borders. And so, in the United States, among researchers that look at the impacts of geographic context, there, over the decades, since William Julius Wilson's 1987 Truly Disadvantaged book came out, and people started considering neighborhoods as important factors in educational outcomes or labor market outcomes, debate around what geography is the right geography to use. Sure. And I would say that varies by the outcome that you're looking at and what process you're considering. So if you're thinking about population health, for instance, maybe, a larger, depending on, what you're studying, if you're, thinking about exposure to radiation and you are living near a defunct nuclear power site or a nuclear testing facility, as I grew up in Los Angeles around, that might be a larger area of exposure and contamination than something that's a different social product, different outcome that you're looking at. And so what I've tried to do is just try to be as specific as possible when I'm looking at educational outcomes, and getting down to the block group is the lowest. Getting down to the census tract is the lowest I can actually go. That's the lowest that the Bureau of Labor Statistics will give me.
And how many blocks are in a census code?
It varies. Like I said, in Manhattan, it could be 1. Yeah, if you have an extremely dense block, 4,000 people can maybe fit in 1 or 2 blocks in Manhattan, but could be a county in Iowa or Nebraska or something. It could be miles wide in that case. Yeah.
Right, thank you. We have got this 5 minutes left. I've got 2 questions. Do you want to go first, Pauline? And there's one person online, and then I think we'll have to call it a day. So, Pauline, go ahead.
I wonder, about whether you could expand in this idea of like how Latinos and Black students are increasing their livelihoods to access colleges despite the effects of neighbor disadvantage. How this look like in university? Are these more diverse and so on? Is it like the composition of colleges changing too with time? And the other thing I wonder is whether there are like an intergenerational effect of the neighborhood in the sense that the children who do attend college, they have a purchase power, for example, for the homes there, and how that might express also like throughout the cohorts.
Yeah. So in reaction to 1960s legislation around civil rights in the United States, from which policies like affirmative action were birthed in the United States, the federal and state and local resources that were specifically targeted at the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, and that due to racial segregation, the history of racial segregation policies in the United States were largely Black and Latino neighborhoods, you would see oftentimes more investments in the educational facilities of those worst neighborhoods than other neighborhoods down the line, which could potentially explain why it is that perhaps Black and Latino students who are growing up in the worst neighborhoods might have had increased educational likelihoods, say enrolling in college, than students who were not in those neighborhoods. So that is, in addition to thinking about the individual, like when I'm looking at my selectivity outcomes, for instance, or the college enrollment, the type of student who's going to emerge from those places is highly selective themselves and go to college, right? So the kid themselves is probably going to be pretty exceptional after growing up in that environment to be in a position at all, right, to apply and go to college. So those things sort of play out as well a little bit in terms of the first question. The second question, remind me?
It was about like the
intergenerational, right? So in terms of investing back into those neighborhoods, this comes to play specifically in one of my assumptions here, that there is no impact. What this is called is selection bias in this framework that Felix Edward and Fabian Pfeffer rolled out. They argue that in order for this process to work, your going to college should not impact the quality of your old neighborhood. And so I think that this path E is reasonable to exclude. What they're showing here is selection bias itself. What I'm assuming is that those kids that go to college are likely not going back to their neighborhoods, or not influencing the neighborhoods that their parents choose to live in. So oftentimes, you'll find that those students who are the most, students who are exposed to neighborhood disadvantage, for instance, and go off to college are likely have the internal, motivation, the ganas, or like the grit, as the other word, to continue on in adulthood, ascending, and are oftentimes less likely to move back to neighborhoods, to not have that influence that you're sort of describing. We have one more question?
Yeah, and it's an online one, but I'll read it out because we're a bit short of time. So thank you, Stephen. I'm a Notre Dame graduate, MA 88. I know that Notre Dame attracts quite a bit of legacy enrollees. Do such student enrollment fit into any of your categorizations, and how? And that's from Glenn, who's online.
In terms of the neighborhood, the increasing in the influence of neighborhoods, I suppose it would, right? In terms of how say one's parent went to Notre Dame or went to Yale or wherever, and then influenced where they grew up, where they raised their children, how that process of going to college in generation one influenced the location of where generation two grew up. That could potentially have an impact, in as well, in terms of the likelihood of that second generation child or children going off to college themselves. But I don't look at that specifically in my data. It would be fascinating to just do a whole study. It's in and of itself about legacy admissions, which of course the United States Supreme Court also excluded from the affirmative action ruling. So that still is in play in the United States, and in and of itself is a whole category of inequality that many researchers, I'm sure, are interested in looking at.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So thank you very much, people online and in the room, and big thanks to Stephen for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you very much.